Okay, everyone, welcome to the Trauma-Informed Approach to After-School Programs. This is a 5-part webinar series sponsored by Wisconsin After-School Network in the Marshfield Clinic. My name is Tony Inigas, and I'm an education specialist with the Marshfield Clinic Child Advocacy Center. And my co-presenter is Jennifer Smith, so I'll let her introduce herself.
I'm the after-school program manager with the Marshfield Clinic Center for Community Outreach. I oversee an after-school program in the Marshfield area that's a referral-based program, as well as work with the Wisconsin After-School Network to provide training and technical assistance to after-school programs.
And both of us have been in education, for quite a few years. I taught high school art and elementary art for over 17 years in Illinois, and then also in central Wisconsin most recently.
And I started out as an elementary and middle school special education teacher, and now work at the Marshfield Clinic.
So before we begin, just if you guys have any questions, there is a question tab in a chat. I know that some of you have to stay, can only stay for the hour, but again, this presentation will be archived. And for those of you that can, if we do go a little bit longer than that, we'll provide an opportunity to answer maybe a few questions at the end of the presentation. And so with that, we'll begin. And so the objectives for the series, for this 5-part series, is understanding the repercussions of trauma and neglect on healthy development and the poor outcomes that result from that over the life course. The other thing we really want you to take out of the series is an understanding of the role that brain development and function plays in addressing student needs. Unfortunately, a lot of our educators and people that work with children don't really have a clear grasp of how the brain develops and how the brain functions, yet we know that learning and all of the things that our children do in after-school programming revolve around learning. Those are all brain-based activities. And so if we don't have an understanding of how brain develops and how it's affected, then how can we teach or incorporate or take the task of working with children in a learning activity. We also hope that by the end of the session you will understand the role that mental state plays in learning and development, not only the child's mental state, but the staff member, the teacher, the caregiver. Their mental state dictates a lot as to how the student will progress and function in your program. And then you'll notice that significance of attachment and attunement has a little asterisk next to it. We can't emphasize enough how important the ability to relate and to attach to other human beings is to learning. And since we're working with children, that's one of the things that is going to give you it's going to have the most impact and the most positive results in your programs. Hopefully later on we'll learn about some modes of regulation, and then we'll hope to provide you with some tangible tools and trauma responsive interventions that you can utilize today, the next day, or in the future. So when you look here, this is part 1 of our 5-part series, and we'll focus on understanding trauma and how it affects brain development and learning. We will look again at specific interventions for the after-school program. When you look at this photo, it shows what a traditional approach to learning and overall healthy development used to look like. This approach used to value working with others, connecting, self-awareness, and physical movement as much as academic proficiency. Unfortunately, the way our states and the federal government is moving in a direction that we tend to focus more on academic results and test scores and results versus the overall health and well-being of the child. We hope that throughout this series you will appreciate the significant role that body movement and kinesthesis and our senses play in children's ability to regulate and self-soothe. When the average person that looks at this photo, it just seems like girls that are playing a game. But to the child's brain, this is an exercise in regulation and self-soothing.
So we're going to start with a little bit of foundational information. We're going to talk about the Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE study. The ACE study was done quite some time ago, 1995 to 1997, but it's really just becoming popular and having more awareness across settings outside of the medical environment. This was done in the Kaiser Permanente clinic in California. And so in the ACE study, what they did was they looked at adverse childhood experiences, so abuse, neglect, and how that impacted later life, health, and well-being. In the clinic, when you go to see your physician, you usually have a questionnaire to fill out about your current health condition. They embedded some questions targeting specific incidents that may have happened before the age of 18, and they used that information then to get some results to make a comparison between those early life experiences and later life health. So over 17,000 people were included in the study, and so it was a very large pool of individuals who were polled. And the interesting piece of this study is that those members were insured, so they were not of a low socioeconomic status population where you would think they might be more vulnerable to some more adverse experiences. This was a pretty middle class cross-section of Southern California, so that provides a little bit of interesting information. So our first poll question today is, how many of you, or are you, able to explain the findings of the ACE study? Are you familiar with it, and would you be able to explain it to someone else? Yes or no? We'll give you a few minutes.
And as we're going through this poll, one of the things that before we look at the results, we're seeing quite a few, or an even number now at this point, of yeses and nos. I would say that it's not too important for you to be able to explain the survey. I think it's more important to understand, how it impacts, the kids that we work with. So we're going to go ahead and close that poll. I'm going to share those results.
So we're pretty close to 50-50. And I think, the teaching adage is, if you're able to teach someone else, you really have a good grasp of the content. So we'll take a few minutes just to review some of the information that came from the ACE study. So in the original survey, the questions that were embedded for the patients to answer when they came in for their appointments were questions around physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, and then household dysfunction. So witnessing domestic violence, having a caregiver with mental illness in the home, having drug use in the home, someone in the family who had been incarcerated, or divorced or separated parents. So these questions, as they were embedded, indicated that the individuals had some adverse childhood experiences associated with these particular situations. So what they found is that it was quite common that almost 2/3, about 60% of study participants had at least one ACE. So 60% of adults in this survey said that at least one of those events had occurred in their life prior to the age of 18. More than 1 in 5 reported to have 3 or more ACEs, so at least 3 of those situations that we just looked at on the previous slide had occurred in their childhood. The study really showed that there was a dose-response relationship between those adverse experiences and later poor health outcomes. So what that means is the more adverse experiences you had in childhood, the poorer your health was, and generally the less positive, I guess, your overall feeling about your life outcome, your health and well-being in a general sense. That also had a negative relationship.
And in some cases, it was a predisposition to early death as well.
Right. So up to 20 years, actually. So that's fairly significant.
And the other thing that I find interesting about this study is that when we look at, so the Kaiser Permanente study looked again at predominantly white, highly educated males. They were insured. And yes, that population does have a lot of stress and things that go on in their lives. But when you look at, if you take a population that more closely resembles where we live, where there's a significant amount of poverty, rural communities, I would only imagine that those numbers would increase, again, as a result of having to lead a more stressful life.
Absolutely. So as we said, 60% of adults reported experiencing abuse or some other difficult family circumstance during their childhood. 26% of children in the United States will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4. So kids who are entering school and entering the after-school programs, a quarter of those children have already experienced at least one traumatic event. 75 to 93% of the youth who enter the juvenile justice system in our country have been victims of childhood trauma. So that's a pretty clear relationship between an adverse experience in early childhood and a negative outcome later in life. Those kids clearly are really struggling with some poor behaviors, having difficulty with support systems, and so then they end up in the juvenile justice system.
And unfortunately, we know that punitive responses to trauma do not work. And so by punishing these children and putting them in detention centers and creating a more chaotic environment for them, we're only facilitating their dysregulation or their poor outcomes.
Right. So the original ACE study data in pie format shows you the areas that were predominantly identified. So physical abuse and substance abuse are the two highest adverse experiences that were identified through the study. Interestingly, they have a pretty similar percentage, 28%, 27%, and oftentimes you think about substance abuse and physical abuse co-occurring. So maybe there's substance abuse in the home, and then when the parent or caregiver is under the influence, they have a lower stress tolerance, and so then they are likely to be more abusive. So I think that is kind of an interesting piece of the data. If you look at the purple on the pie chart, which is 0 adverse experiences, that's fairly small. The rest of the pie chart shows the individuals who had 1 or more, and the bright yellow is 4 or more, which really is the tipping point when looking at the study. So here's our chart looking at some poor later life outcomes: chronic bronchitis, alcoholism, attempted suicide. If you look at the number of adverse childhood experiences, as those experiences increase, so does the likelihood of those illnesses or events. And I think the attempted suicide really illustrates the significant impact that an adverse experience early in life can have. That bright yellow 18% attempted suicide is significantly higher than the 1% of individuals who had none. So ACEs and after-school programs, why are adverse childhood experiences important to us? I think it's important for us to acknowledge that they exist and that trauma and chronic stress are very common and have negative impacts on our communities and our after-school programs. So children who are living in toxic stress or abusive or negligent environments are walking into our programs on a daily basis. And so having some strategies and helping us to really help support those children is going to help everyone. Generational poverty or poor parenting caregiving can really be a cycle, and understanding that chronic unaddressed mental health problems and that increased level of stress really contribute to the ongoing occurrence of adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, and with generational poverty and poor parenting is, we know that we parent the way we were parented and we teach the way we were taught, and so it takes a little bit of work for us to be able to change those approaches. And so it's very, very important for anyone that works with children in education or after-school programs to understand that the way you were taught and the way you were disciplined will not always work with children that have been maltreated or have experienced quite a few or significant number of ACEs in their past.
So this graphic is from Washington State, and it is a high school classroom, but I think we can extrapolate this to any after-school program. It's looking at a typical group of 30 children and what you would see as the breakdown of the number of ACEs. So the first row is the only group that has no adverse experiences in their childhood. And if you look at the back row, the back two rows, so the children who have had 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 adverse childhood experiences, those children are going to be the most challenging in your after-school program, and are the children where traditional disciplines or the way that you manage children in your program traditionally are not going to have the same effectiveness. And so we really need to look at how do we help address the needs of that population who's in our after-school programs every day.
And unfortunately, those are the kids that need it the most. They're the ones that, they're the hardest for us to, in some cases, want to bond with or want to connect with. But sadly, those are the ones that need you the most. And so we can't overlook those children. The fact is that many of our kids in after-school programs struggle with self-control and regulation. Some will have experienced severe trauma and neglect. Many live in chaos, poverty, and less than ideal environments. They struggle to form meaningful and healthy relationships. And as teachers and caregivers, we struggle to meet those student needs. Sometimes we're ill-equipped. We don't have the tools to be able to deal with significant or complex trauma in children's lives. Teachers and caregivers may not understand how trauma affects healthy development, cognition, which is learning, and behaviors. And so if we don't understand how it affects it, then we can respond to it appropriately.
So we really need to change our approach, or the way that we look at the children in our after-school program, from attention seeking, so that child is acting out because they just want attention, to connection seeking. That child really struggles with having healthy relationships, and so they don't have the skills to develop those healthy connections. So they're acting out in an effort to try and get you to connect with them. So shifting our focus a little bit, shifting from trouble seeking to bond seeking. Kids, again, are trying to connect. They want a sense of belonging, don't have the skills or ability to do that. Shifting from what were you thinking to what were you feeling. So students who are impulsive, who overreact in situations, often are not thinking. Their thinking brain's not engaged, and they're really focusing, working really out of emotion and reaction. So asking what were you feeling and helping them to learn to identify their feelings and how they can manage their bodies when they start to feel that way.
And with that, I think, one of the ways that we can help them be able to express their feelings is, as staff and as educators, we have to model that for them. So instead of yelling or screaming at them, you can say, I'm feeling upset or I'm feeling sad because of this. And so you give them a concrete reason as to why you're feeling the way that you do, and you're modeling that versus just, pointing your finger and directing someone out the door or to someone else. Mm-hmm. That it's not going to help them any.
Right. And then the last one is shifting from what's wrong with you to what have you gone through. Or we ask students in our program, tell me what happened today. Your behavior is telling me that something's going on, and how can we help you, or how can I support you right now? And it's amazing the response that you will get from kids when you sit down and say, you're really struggling with the group activity today. What's going on? How can I support you right now? How many kids will share with you some stressful or negative experiences that have gone on in their previous 24 hours that are impacting their ability to function at that moment in time?
So trauma-informed programs, and we hope that one of the reasons why you're joining this webinar is because you're trying to take the steps to become trauma-informed. They recognize, as Jen said earlier, that trauma exists in our community. We can't deny that. And so that's the first step. We have to recognize and accept that it exists. We have to recognize that it affects healthy development and learning. We have to recognize that the traumatized brain has been rewired differently by traumatic experiences or by poor caregiving. So again, it's nothing personal. It's not that the kids are personally trying to make your day worse. They're not trying to make you angry. They're not trying to just get attention. Is that their brain, because of their experiences, has been rewired slightly differently than ours. We have to recognize that responding to trauma will not only positively impact all the kids in your program, the caregivers and the teachers. And so these interventions are as much for you as they are for the children that are challenging, and they're as much for the rest of the kids. Because if we're able to help these children that are challenging be able to exhibit self-control, you're basically lessening one, you have one less experience where that child, by acting out, by their reaction, they're not re-traumatizing other children in the classroom or in the after-school setting. So trauma, neglect, and poor caregiving is the enemy of regulation, and there is no way around it. Okay, and we'll define what regulation means here in another slide. So our next section, we're going to look at regulation and dysregulation. And so if trauma is the enemy of regulation, then dysregulation is the enemy of learning. It is the enemy of development, and is is public enemy number one of the student. So regulation is a fancy or a trendy word for self-control, which means the ability to control or adjust according to internal or external expectations. Internally, our brain stem and our midbrain does a lot of that regulation. And you'll understand in a little bit why that is. But again, those lower brain regions control our breathing, our heart rate, our core body temperature, and those sorts of things. External regulation is a little bit more challenging. That means that we have to have the ability and the skills to filter our responses and our thoughts. If you want to do, and I don't recommend this, that for those of you that are employed, that you necessarily do this at work, but if you ever want to see or think about how some of these children are reacted to, think about going through a day in your life without filtering anything. So basically being able to say anything and everything that comes to mind, acting on every little impulse or every little whim that that comes to your mind. Think about acting on it, okay? And more than likely you'd lose your job. Some of us, like Jen, might get arrested. Just kidding, Jen. But it would be, but that's what our kids that are dysregulated, that's what they go through. They cannot filter their responses and their thoughts, and yet we punish them for it. So regulation is about impulse control and emotional control. So dysregulation is the inability to control our mental state, our thoughts, and our responses and our behaviors, or responses to our behaviors. It's all about skill, not will. And so that's one of the things that both Jen and I really want to make sure that everyone out there understands, is that it's not that they don't want to, it's just that they don't have the skills to be able to exhibit that self-control or that regulation. And then the other component of this is that we many times contribute to children's dysregulation. And again, by our responses, by the way we interact with them. And sometimes it's because we are upset or we're under severe stress ourselves. Other times we might be trying to do the right thing, but by trying to do the right thing, we actually make things worse. So for example, a child that maybe wants space, but yet we continue to approach them, or we make contact with them, or we follow them across the room because we want to keep an eye on them. That's basically making things worse for that child. So some symptoms of dysregulation, which I'm sure all of you will be very familiar with. Children can be hyper-responsive, which means that the saying of making a mountain out of a molehill. Our kids are basically the Mount McKinley of mountains, right? So their responses are huge compared to what a typical response by a child that maybe has not experienced trauma or dysregulation, what their response would be. These kids are often, and adults too, for that matter. It's not just the children. A lot of times we'll see these symptoms in adults, and so the adage of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree is very true. But again, that's not to put down the parents or the family. It's more a result of generational again, trauma and generational poor caregiving or poor parenting. They're oftentimes explosive, violent. They lack empathy and compassion. And one of the reasons why that is because in order for us to be able to empathize and exhibit compassion towards others, that only happens in the outer regions of the brain. Okay, most animals in the animal kingdom don't have these two traits of empathy and compassion. It's very unique to the human species, and the reason why that is because we do have a larger brain. We do have those outer brain regions that can learn these traits. They have no filter. And then on this column on the left, I want to talk about kids that are often missed. Okay, so the column on the right, or I'm sorry, the column on the left are kids that, it's the squeaky wheel. So the squeaky wheel always gets the oil. You notice them. Those are kids that have responses that we refer to as acting out. The column on the right are kids that act in. So they dissociate. They basically shut down. They tune out. They become disengaged. A lot of times they become avoidant initially. So they don't want to do the activity. They won't tell you why. They just refuse. And then sadly, sometimes they become compliant. They, again, because of their body trying to respond and survive, they'll just give in. Again, they're checked out or numb, often ignored. They're mislabeled as defiant. And these are the kids that fly under the radar. And so, keep an eye on those kids too. Because they're not acting out, because they're acting in, we may not notice that they are also experiencing trauma and stress at home or in their life. So we're going to go ahead and launch the next poll question. If I can find it. Oh, there we go. Poll questions.
So I'm going to imagine that when you look at the previous list of symptoms of the acting out and the acting in child, the question is, does a child from your program come to mind? So we'll see. The responses are coming in, so we'll give everybody a minute.
Yeah, we don't need a minute. 100%.
Okay, so we had 100% response, yes. And as Tony and I were creating the webinar, we had this very conversation that every single after-school program will be able to identify with the list of symptoms. Yes, there are kids in our program every day who fit that description.
Right. And so we hope, too, that as you're thinking about that poll question, that, again, you're pinpointing kids that act out, but then maybe start looking at your program and trying to figure out which are those kids that are again flying under the radar, and what are the things that you can do to be able to connect with those kids. As we mentioned earlier, attachment and connection and bonding is one of the things that we're going to drive back and forth. Did I hide the poll? Sorry.
I don't know. Yeah, let's double check.
Let me make sure that poll question's not. Nope. There we go. Thank you for being patient with us. So what are some causes of dysregulation? There are some genetic conditions, but those are very, very rare. Very rare. The second cause for dysregulation are things that happen while the infant is in the womb. And so again, it could happen anytime from conception to birth. And so those might be things where the mom is exposed to alcohol or drugs, poor nutrition, prolonged labor, which results in oxygen debt. In some cases, those children might have cerebral palsy, and in some cases, they have no physical symptoms, but they'll have some of these disruptions later on as they start to go to preschool and then into school. They get into school age. The other component about this too that's very, very important is that again, some of these things are things that maybe the mom does, but what if the mom is experiencing domestic violence at home? So her stress And so basically her reaction to stress, or her stress response during pregnancy, not only affects her own body but it also, there's this thing called epigenetics that basically um, those stresses can be passed on to her infant child. And so then when the child is born, they're already born with the predisposition for dysregulative behaviors. Then after birth, right? So anytime between birth and death, so extreme trauma, and that could be a single event. It could be a tornado. It could be a terrorist attack. It could be
House fire.
a house fire. Absolutely. It could be anything. Chronic trauma. So again, something that happens day in and day out. And then stress. When we think about stress, think about a lot of our kids that don't know where their next meal is going to come from. And that is very stressful because, again, we are wired for survival. And so if our basic needs are not met, our brain basically overengages those stress response systems. And if there's nobody there to kind of help buffer that stress, there's not a loving parent, a loving teacher, a loving after-school staff member, then that child suffers tremendously. Attachment problems, which is basically, it comes down to poor caregiving. And I think this is the one that's real easy to kind of pass the buck or pass the blame. And most of the time the primary caregiver is usually the parent, mom and dad. In some cases it might be grandma. Obviously in severe cases where children are removed from the home, then it might be a foster parent or an adoptive family. But if the primary caregiver is going through depression, or again, experiencing domestic violence, or they themselves are being neglectful to the child, or they exhibit harsh parenting, all of those things are going to prevent children from developing in a normal way. So dysregulated students rarely communicate needs in a clear and direct manner using words. So they're not going to go up to you and say, I'm really upset because I'm afraid that when I get home tonight, my dad is going to hit me. Or I'm really upset because when I get home, I'm not sure if there's going to be anyone home to let me in, or there's going to be anyone home to be able to cook food for me. They can't tell you that. Instead, their body does the talking. Okay, so they're responding reactively and reflexively. They're not using the thinking brain region, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Under heavy stress, the human brain is wired to survive, not to think. Okay, and that is very, very important. If we didn't have that mechanism, our species would have not survived over millions of years. And so what ends up happening is those outer brain regions basically shut down, and all of the blood and all of the connections and synaptic connections are basically being made at those lower brain regions that control survival. It's basically like a stuck accelerator for these kids. They're constantly in their survival brain. The good news is that the brain is very plastic and is capable of changing. Through repetition, pattern, and our senses, we are able to read and speak new languages. So think about how a child first acquires language. Okay, so you have an infant baby and you want to teach them what a bottle is. You're holding the child. The child hopefully sees the bottle. They'll feel the bottle nipple on their mouth. They'll feel the milk. And then the parent then uses language and says either the word bottle or baba. And this doesn't happen just one time. That's not how memory is made. This has to happen thousands and thousands of times. And then eventually, as a child gets older, they make that connection between, again, the repetition of you giving them the bottle and saying the word, and then actually seeing it, feeling it, and tasting the milk inside the bottle. And so that's something that's very important for us to know, because that's going to guide a lot of the interventions that we're going to share with you later on. They're all going to be about repetition, pattern, and they're going to somehow involve one or more of our senses. Again, we're able to adapt to new technologies, learn new skills. So even at a nice prime age like myself, if I wanted to, I could learn a new sport or a new skill. I may not be Olympic, caliber, but I could still learn that skill. And again, through repetition, pattern, and our senses, we're able to rewire or change our brain chemistry. So let's look at brain development. And so when we look at this slide of this head of lettuce, it really resembles the brain quite a bit. So when you think about this head of lettuce growing in the ground from a seed, it basically starts from the stem and then it grows up. But not only does it just grow up, it also grows out. Okay, so it's bottom up and then inside out, and that's how our brain develops in utero as well, from conception. We start with a brain stem, which would be right here, and then we would have our midbrain, and then we have our limbic brain, and then these outer leaves, these very thin outer leaves of the lettuce, that's basically our cortex, and that is our thinking brain. And so you notice that that develops later on in life. We have to be able to survive first. So critical brain development occurs from conception through early adulthood, age 26. And so some of you might have heard the adage of keep them alive till 25. It's absolutely true. You know, and so some of you might be out there that are in your early 20s and you're thinking like, oh, I'm all grown up. But the fact is that your brain is still growing and is still developing, and the choices and the decisions that you make after age 26 are going to be very different from the ones that you'll make at age 25 or 24. This slide shows majority of brain growth that occurs by age 3. And so you notice that here's a brain at week 1, 3 months, 1 year. By 2 years, the brain is actually growing about as much as it's going to grow. And so now you notice this huge leap between 2 years and 10 years, and you don't see a lot of mass that's being created at that point. And then if we had a slide that showed an adult brain, it would not be much bigger than the 10-year-old brain. And so it's kind of good and it's kind of bad. The bad news is that by the time we get our kids into the school system, either in 4K, 5K, a lot of their brain development has already happened. And so a lot of the, if they've experienced a lot of trauma and neglect, we're going to, the impact that we're going to have is going to be a lot less than if the trauma or the neglect happened during, while they're 10 years old, because they've already had a lot of the majority of their brain growth happen at that time. So brain growth is a function of neural connections, about 700 to 1,000 per second. And those are connections that are direct responses to experiences. And so, for example, if a child, an infant, has no experiences, then there are going to be no connections. And so you might think, well, how could that happen? It does happen. We have parents who put children in a car seat or a playpen, and they just leave them there for hours unattended. They don't talk to them. They don't touch them. They don't interact with them. And so those children are not learning language. They're not having any good experiences or loving experiences.
I had a friend who went on a mission trip to Africa and went into an orphanage, and she had shared that the eeriest thing was a room full of babies and not one of them was crying. And they had learned that crying did not gauge any sort of response, and so they were making no connections. They were laying in cribs because they had not had any experiences to help build those connections. They were just completely disconnected little human beings laying in cribs.
And that is the perfect example of dissociation. So when we talk about we talked about hyper-responsive and kids that are dissociative. That's exactly what happens. The kids, if no one is there to ever meet their needs, so if you have parents that aren't around or parents that are inconsistent, the kids basically, they shut down and they stop responding. And so that's a perfect example of dissociation. And then again, if there's bad connection, so if you have harsh parenting, then kids learn that that's how you respond under severe stress. And brain development is use dependent, like muscles and organs in our human body. If we don't use it, we lose it. And so here's a perfect slide that shows that. On the left, you have a 3-year-old normal brain, and you can see how big it is. And then on the right, you have a slide that depicts a 3-year-old child who suffered extreme neglect, and you notice how small and atrophied. Well, it wouldn't be atrophied because it never developed, but how small that brain is. So here's our next poll question, and we're not gonna launch it, but we'll. Or do you think we should launch it?
We can.
All right, we're gonna launch it. So, are there more connections or links occurring in the internet or a child's brain? And the hint is here: the internet has about 100+ trillion links or connections being made. So we'll go ahead and look for this poll. We'll let you decide. Cheaters. All right, there we go. Now some cheaters. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and close that poll. I'm going to share it. So we had 87% are picking the child's brain versus the internet. So I'm going to go ahead and hide that. Oops. And we'll take a look. Sorry about that commercial. Bye, Pons.
So are there more connections in a child's brain or on the internet? Well, the internet has over 100 trillion links. And an adult's brain has 300 trillion links. But get this, a child's brain has a quadrillion connections, 10 times the number of connections of the entire internet. A child's brain has more connections than the entire internet. Yes, it blew our minds too. How is that even possible? Let's break it down. As we said, a baby is born with 100 billion neurons. But those quadrillion connections, they're not there yet. Those connections form at a very rapid speed during the first 5 years of life, at 700 to 1,000 new synapses per second. Those connections are created through every interaction a child has, and are important because they form the architecture of the brain. So every time you talk to and engage with a child, you are literally growing a brain, connecting the different parts of the brain, which allows for new ideas, insights, and creative thinking. So each moment of eye contact, each new word exchanged, each time you make a child laugh, you are strengthening these connections. And since there are so many different ways to do this, we ask people around the world, send us videos of your favorite ways to engage with the children in your life. During these early years, a child's brain makes as many connections as possible. And then it begins pruning the ones that aren't used and strengthening the ones that are. A dynamic process that continues throughout life. But since a child's brain is activated by everything it encounters, it can also be overwhelmed, which causes stress. When the brain experiences stress, the body's alarm system is activated. If the stress is relieved quickly, the system easily returns to normal. And while learning to deal with stress is an important part of development, severe situations such as ongoing abuse or neglect, where there is no caring adult to relieve the stress, leaves the body's alarm system activated, which can have serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Toxic stress can lead to a body system set permanently on high alert. It causes the synapses we use for learning and self-control to be pruned, while connections for fear and rash behavior get stronger. While the brain can change throughout the rest of life, these early years are fundamental in building a strong foundation for curiosity, creativity, and adaptability. And if we say that the internet is in the...
Sorry about that. We'll, all right, so hopefully you find that video informative. And one of the things that I really want you to take from that video is at the end it talked about toxic stress, and toxic stress is basically it's a state in which the body is overly engaged or the stress response systems of the body are overly engaged. They're stuck because there is nobody to provide that that soothing or that support there. So again, when we look at brain hierarchy and how it develops, we start with the brainstem and the midbrain. So it starts from simple to complex. This is what we call our survival brain or our survival region. And this is our default under stress for species survival. And this happens for everyone. Okay, so for those of you that are adults that drive, if you've ever been driving like in a big city with a lot of traffic that you're not used to, the outer parts of your brain are shutting down. Okay, so basically these are the only parts that are being engaged, and so you're not able to express your emotions and your language the way you normally would. Okay, so the next part of the brain develops is the limbic and then the cortex. These are what we call our thinking or our learning brain regions. Humans process information in the lower brain regions first, and the information then moves up to the cortex, but only if the brain is well regulated. So if we look at this slide here, this orange cog or sprocket here would be the brainstem, and so think what would happen, right? As this spins, it spins the green one, the pink one, the yellow, the orange, the red, and then the purple. But what if I took out the yellow one? Okay, so and this is what happens to trauma. Let's say I take that connection out, then these lower parts will still continue to motor, but then these other ones will stop spinning. They will not function anymore. And we'll see another slide that kind of explains that a little bit. So again, the brain develops bottom up, inside out. All parts are interconnected. So if you knock out one part or power in one part, it will affect the others. Okay, so here we have the brainstem, the midbrain, the limbic, and you see how they're all interconnected. The lights are all on. What if we experience trauma in the midbrain region? It knocks out that connection, which then shuts out the lights for the other regions. And so this is a perfect example, like if you think of Christmas lights, a series of lights where these lights are out and you have no idea which of those light bulbs is the one that's missing. And so that's the challenge for working with these kids that are dysregulated. And so the logical thing for most of us to do with these lights would be find the light that is, you know, lit, and then start working our way up to figure out which of these is the one that's out. And so that's the way we have to adapt and make our interventions with these children. And so a lot of our interventions are based on the midbrain and the brainstem, and those are a lot of skills that work with gross motor and fine motor movement. So how does trauma affect the brain? So non-attentive adult, neglectful caregiving does not provide enough opportunities for connections or speech and language. And this is some review for you. Non-responsive caregiving forces the brain to over-engage survival regions. So this becomes their new normal. And one of the things that we understand is that as humans, we don't like change. Okay, we don't like changing things. We like to stick to our routines. And so what happens with children that experience severe trauma and neglect, that chaotic brain or that survival brain, that's their normal. And so then when you put them in an environment that it's quiet and soothing, it is very unnerving to them. And that's why they act out, because it just, they don't feel right. Okay, they're used to chaotic environment at home or in other places. Again, we get a smaller brain, and it also keeps us from being creative, reflective, compassionate, and empathetic beings. All right, so simply stated, trauma, chaos, poverty, and chronic and extreme stress are very, very bad. They knock out connections to higher brain regions, and it keeps us from being exercising self-control, being reflective thinkers, from forming healthy relationships, and from being able to reason and learn.
So let's take a look at, in our after-school programs, what are the most challenging times of day, particularly for the students that you may have pictured in your head associating with some of those symptoms of dysregulation. So transportation time, arriving on the bus, transitioning from one activity to another, any unstructured time or play during programming, snack or meals, or academic and homework help time. Probably most of you would agree that these are all areas where you might see some increased behavior with some of those kids who are really challenging. So on the bus is a fairly it's a fairly like survival of the fittest environment. There's generally little supervision.
It's a fertile ground for dysregulation.
Absolutely. So negative peer interactions, potentially bullying. There's a high energy level on the bus. All the kids just got out of school. They're excited to be out of school, and so that energy is going with them onto the bus. High noise levels. Some kids may, have unsafe behaviors, climbing over the seat. Potentially the bus driver is not trauma informed, and so may turn around and shout at the kids on the bus, which really just feeds that chaos and the noise, and maybe there's really not a relationship of any kind between the driver and the student. So maybe they have a different driver day to day, or maybe the interactions are just not positive, and so there's really no attachment that's happened.
And I think, if we know that a lot of our teachers are not trauma informed, or may not be, I don't want to say are not, but may not be trauma informed, then why would our bus drivers be? But it doesn't mean that it's an excuse, but it's someone that we can reach out to and help educate on trauma informed responses. We had, when I was, my young son had a bus driver who basically slammed on the brakes to get the kids to quiet down, and so that experience can be frightening and alarming for many kids.
So some interventions that you could try today when kids arrive at your program from the bus or on the bus: modeling and practicing what are appropriate behaviors and expectations on the bus. If you have the possibility for a staff person to periodically ride the bus with kids, that would be beneficial. Having the staff meet the bus when it arrives at your program, board the bus, and greet and dismiss students. So before you have the students exit the bus, try a calming activity. So we do mindfulness in our after-school program, and we have a Tibetan singing bowl, which the kids just think is the coolest thing. So bringing a Tibetan singing bowl on the bus and having everybody sit in their seat and ring the bowl and listen to the singing until the sound goes away. Kids can raise their hands, and then have them calmly exit the bus. Review the schedule for the day before they leave. So when you leave the bus, remember, this is what's happening. Group A is going to snack. Group B is going to the gym for a fitness activity, to help prepare them for those transitions. Try and work with the bus company to see if you can provide some information or training for the drivers, and potentially invite the drivers to come to the program and encourage some bonding and attachment with those kids. Maybe they come to a family night. Maybe they just come at the end of their shift after dropping kids off, and come in and engage with kids in a different setting. The bus is a stressful environment, so having them outside of that may really help to facilitate a relationship.
And I think that there are two very important points here. The first one is greeting the students. I think that when, again, it's all about, we're trying to strengthen our connections with them. So boarding the bus and greeting the students and having that smiling, calm staff member can help the children again, calm and start the afternoon program in a better way. And then again, with the bus driver, again, we're trying to strengthen that connection. If the student has any sort of connection or relationship with the bus driver, they're going to be more likely to want to exhibit positive behaviors on the bus.
So transition times are another challenging time of the day. There's, potentially negative peer interaction, some chaos. I want to be at the front. No, you can't cut. You have some of that going on, which feeds dysregulation. Potentially some unsafe behavior, pushing people out of line. As you're moving, you might have difficulty keeping the group together. Some kids would like to run ahead. Some kids are tailing behind. So, what can you do to try and manage that a little bit? Trying to have consistently scheduled transition times. So talking about repetition every day at 4:15, homework time starts. What time does homework time start? 4:15. So it's consistent. Everybody knows that that's when we move. Practicing some calming activities before and after you transition. So having kids get in line by the door and everybody takes 3 big breaths before you move to the next activity. Adjusting the staff's expectations a little bit after school is not school. So having kids walk in a perfectly quiet, arrow straight line through the after school program, may be a struggle for kids who've really worked hard to keep it together all day and they just don't have any gas left in the tank. So if kids are moving in a peaceful manner, respectful of each other in a group, that's probably okay. And moving them into an engaging activity. So if you are moving from homework to art and you arrive at the art center and nothing is ready to go and kids enter that area and the staff person has to disengage from the kids to get the supplies and get everything set up, then you're inviting some dysregulation and chaos into that environment. If kids can move into the activity and immediately sit down and start participating in whatever the art project is, you help to keep that regulation under control.
One of the schools in our area, they do this, the hallway transition. The only rule is that they have to stay quiet, but they're able to hop on one foot. They're able to, skip if they want to. And so there's, I think, a lot of creative ways that, again, you're building that connection with the kids, yet you're getting them to where they need to be, and they're doing it in a way that's appropriate for your program.
So unstructured time or free play, again, some negative peer interaction. Maybe there's some bullying or perceived bullying. So students who are heightened, it doesn't take very much for them to feel like someone is really picking on them. Or there may be some exclusion. You can't play with us. We're playing this and we don't want you as part of our group. There's a lot of energy, feeds some dysregulation. Maybe staff in an unstructured time is really in a supervisory mode. They're standing around the perimeter of the activity versus a participatory mode, which is really what would be preferred, that they're engaged in the activity alongside the kids. So what are some interventions for these unstructured times? Provide some loose structure for the environment. So, don't just send kids out in a total free-for-all. Have some parameters around it. Maybe have some equipment that they can utilize that can facilitate some of the play. Provide some voice and choice. So maybe they have a couple options and they can choose from one of those options. Review the expectations before you start the activity. So review safety, having respect for their peers while they're playing in these activities, and having the staff engaged so that they're alongside the kids participating. By being in the activity with the kids, they're providing better supervision and they're also helping to develop those relationships. So snack or mealtime can be loud, chaotic. If everybody is in the snack area for 15 minutes and you have to wait until everybody's done, sometimes that's difficult to wait. So what are some interventions that we can do during snack time? Having your staff sit and eat with the kids. One of the things you can do is at the table talk about your highs and lows for the day. What were the good things that happened to you today? What are the things that weren't so great? Create families. So create some subset grouping. So maybe one staff person sits with the same 5 or 6 kids every day, and they create a pseudo family. And so then bonds are created between those kids and that staff person. You can model table conversation and manners, taking turns, listening to each other speak. Have a quiet activity available for the kids who are quick eaters. If they're done, have a table with mindful coloring sheets at the back. A couple days in our program, the kids are, really into watching Vines. So we found some kid-appropriate Vines, and they're 30-second videos. We let the kids watch a couple Vines before they transition to the next activity. And then again, having a calming activity before you transition. So maybe at snack time, it could be a moment of gratitude, being grateful for the staff who prepared the food that everybody was able to eat that day. So academic or homework time, kids maybe don't want to be accountable for their work. They don't want to take responsibility. They're avoidant. So either they're disruptive by acting out and being hyper-responsive, or they're dissociative where they tune out and they sit in the back of the room and they ignore when you're asking them what they have for homework. So what might be some interventions? Having consistent expectations and routines. So when homework time starts, everybody gets out their assignment notebook, and we do that every day, every day. That's the pattern, that's the routine. Monotasking. If you work with a child and they have 5 homework assignments, decide what they're going to start with, and then that's all you're going to talk to them about. Okay, you're starting with spelling. Here's a whiteboard. Here's some colored dry erase markers. Your job is to write out your spelling list in multicolor marker.
And even as simple as, you know, the first step, you know, get the backpack or get the homework out, you know, so you don't want to say get the homework out, then get your pencils, then get your paper, then get the list out. You know, they're going to barely remember that first, you know, directive, that let alone, you know, 2 to 5.
Right. And allowing them time to process the directions and the instructions. So if you have a student, you give a direction, get out your assignment notebook, and the child sits there for a minute longer than everybody else. Give them that space, and then approach the child, hopefully, as they get their assignment notebook out. Maybe it takes them a little bit longer to do that.
And just offer a friendly reminder.
Right. And respectful interactions with the students. So you're really always working to build relationships. So, you know, kneeling down next to the child and having an eye-to-eye conversation with them about what they're supposed to be doing or what the activity is, rather than standing over them and giving them directives. Having open communication with the teachers for the students that you're working with in the after-school program, and then really working to strengthen your relationship as an after-school program with the teachers, so that the teachers understand the role of the after-school program, and the after-school program understands what the teacher is expecting of your role as well.
I think that some schools have the misunderstanding that after school is basically just an extension of school.
Right.
And so they just want homework and things to be completed, and then they're upset when they're not turned in the next day, not understanding that there's a whole lot more that's being offered in the after-school program.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the call to action, you know, number 1 is become a trauma-informed after-school program, and check, you've kind of done that. You're taking the first steps. You understand a little bit about how the brain works and what trauma does to the brain. The next step is really to become a trauma-responsive staff. That means that you have the knowledge, you have the basic knowledge, but now what do you do about it? Okay, it's not good enough to know that trauma exists, to know that ACEs exist. Is, you know, arming your staff and arming yourself with the ability to respond appropriately to those kids. So trauma-responsive programs adapt to the developmental needs of the students. Okay, so we're not looking at just age-specific targeted instruction or interventions. We're looking at where developmentally they are. Trauma-responsive programs formulate, they develop, and they design brain-based interventions and responses not only to academic, but also to social and emotional setbacks. They integrate trauma-responsive approaches into their program. They model compassionate and empathetic, developmentally appropriate responses to problem solving and challenges. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for us to be able to model compassion and empathy with these kids. It is not an inherent trait. It is a learned trait. And if they don't have anybody at home that is able to model and teach that, then it is our responsibility to model those 2 traits for them. Apply knowledge of brain development and trauma's effect on brain development and learning and healthy outcomes in all aspects of their programming. So at this point, we want to thank you for joining us for this webinar. And our next part 2 is going to be April 26th, and we're going to look at optimizing attachment and relationships in after-school programs. We hope that this was helpful, and for those of you that are interested in more resources, we have the last few slides. You can find the Wisconsin After School Network, the Marshfield Clinic YouthNet, the Marshfield Child Advocacy Center, and then Jen and myself's email. You can click those links and you can direct contact us, the Child Trauma Academy. Think Kids is a great website for learning about collaborative problem solving. DPI, the Wisconsin Department of Instruction, has several modules for trauma education, and also the one that's here, it's about self-care. You have to take care of yourselves in order to be able to take care of children. Dr. Bloom's Sanctuary Model, and then Doodles, Dances, and Ditties. It's an incredible handbook that you can order, and it has a lot of interventions that use the body, the senses, repetition, and movement. So with that, we will end our session, and we'll kind of hang out to see if any of you have any questions. Otherwise, thank you. Jen, do you want to say anything else?
No, thank you very much for participating in the webinar. Hopefully we will see you at future webinars.